Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm so excited about it. We've had it there for a while, but we've only put audio. Now we're putting whole segments up there with video. We have links in the show notes to make it easy to find. And of course, follow us, review us, join the Patreon. It all helps so we can continue having great conversations like the one we're having today with Jim Wallis. Jim Wallis is Georgetown University's Archbishop Desmond Tutu Chair of Faith and Justice. He has served on President Obama's White House Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships and was the founder of Sojourners and is the author of multiple New York Times bestselling books, including his latest book, The False White Gospel, Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Reclaiming Democracy. But the designation of Jim Wallis's renowned career that I'd like to ask you about first is Coach Jim. I saw those baseballs in your office in an interview I was watching, and you talked quite a bit about your time coaching Little League. But specifically, how is being a Little League coach an outworking of your faith and your political convictions?
Well, I'm so glad you included that in the bio because people often forget to do that. At 22 seasons, I coached Little League baseball with both my sons. And one of them is still playing college baseball as a senior, his final season. And the other one's coming over tonight. He's just started Georgetown Law School, but he's a big baseball guy too. It was two things: deeply bonding with my kids. And I tell people all the time, particularly if they're, public figure people, don't leave the time with your kids as your leftover time. You gotta be as disciplined, like about prayer or things that are core to who you are. And so for me, Friday practices and Saturday games and Tuesday games, I worked around those times. And they were very bonding to this day with my boys. And your house becomes a clubhouse for the kids and the parents who drop the kids off early and pick them up after the game. So you get a lot of closeness with parents. So when you get to bond with your kids and their best friends, their teammates, and their parents, it's really a wonderful thing that really shapes your parenting and your relationship with other parents. And I wouldn't trade it for the world. It's one of the best things I ever did.
Yeah, I should mention, just in case my pops listens, that he always talks about those years when my brother and I were of the age of Little League. He coached for probably the better part of a decade, if not more.
Wow.
First with my brother and then me. And my mom was the team mom, diligently, keeping score and keeping all the stats. And yeah, to your point, we became the team clubhouse. And to this day, this is, 30, 40 years ago now, there are kids from those teams that still stay in touch with us, stay in touch with my dad. So it's a magical time that in parenthood and childhood and familyhood, that post-diaper I guess going into adolescence too. It's a great bridge to those tough teenage years.
I had dinner with a bunch of those kids just before they all went back to college, just this fall, and it was just wonderful. I do stay in touch, and we talk about those things all the time. And even when they were like 10, 11, 12, I began to talk to them in the dugout about some larger things. Like I remember, with permission of the Black players on the team and their parents, I raised the issue of the talk that every Black player has with their mom or dad about how to behave with the police. And none of my white players have ever had that talk. And I had some of the Black players say what that talk was to their teammates. And even some of the liberal white parents of DC didn't know about that talk. So I had my kids talking about the talk. And instead of feeling those white players, as some say, they would feel guilty and shameful and responsible for slavery. They didn't. They felt pissed off.
Mm.
Their teammates and classmates of a different race had this talk. So it led to conversations back then about all this, and many of them took systemic racism classes in college. And as I talk to them, they're still on the track in different vocations of trying to do something to make us a better and different place as far as racial reconciliation goes. So even back in the day, we were talking, and of course, Washington, the people who are parents are Washington players, and Obama himself showed up to one of my games, not even though I was coaching. He was doing a little photo op on the way to a fundraiser. And so when Obama shows up at your baseball games, that's Washington baseball.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
Yeah,
But to your point, I think you make some serious points there that sports, participating in sports as a family,
right.
Little League and Pop Warner football and soccer.
Yep.
My kids were on soccer teams there throughout their childhood. There's a way to connect with other people, the
Yeah.
kids across, these barriers and
Yeah.
boundaries that have
Right.
built up, so that it's not that guy who posts that meme on Facebook. It's
Yeah.
the dad of the kid that my play, and now we become friends. There's a humanity now that we have a connection. We have a connection to our humanity, to our families, to our stories, right? Instead of just, one data point or one meme that he posted. So I was curious, speaking of humanity and stories and connecting with people, you had mentioned before we hit record that you've done a lot of traveling just in the recent days and weeks. You mentioned Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Tennessee, all over the country. How do you get? How are people feeling? What kind of sense are you getting from how folks are feeling right now?
Yeah, I've been in dozens of cities now. The book tour became really a regional town meeting tour about faith and democracy. Because I was cared more about that than just the book. North Carolina, Arizona, Georgia, all those places we're going to. And I think people are feeling quite stressed, quite worried about what might happen and trying to figure out what to do about it. And also how we're so polarized. Crossing lines is so hard. In Rocky Mount, North Carolina, which is rural North Carolina, there literally are railroad tracks that divide one county from another, one all white, other black. It's just complete. Now, we're deeply segregated as a nation. There aren't always railroad tracks, but there are other things that are like railroad tracks. Bridges and rivers and highways and just very segregated racial patterns. But they're railroad tracks right there. It's so symbolic of our division as a country. And so I did my event on the black side of the tracks. Bishop Haywood Parker, and his church is called the Truth Tabernacle.
I
So
love
I
it.
used that text. Yeah, I loved it too. That text from Jesus that's in my book. You'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free.
Free. Yeah.
And that word's important. As I dug more deeply into that text in writing, it's like I began to be aware that the opposite of truth isn't just lies, it's captivity, captivity, truth and freedom. So the country is so polarized, and people, even good people, are captive to a lot of lies that are out there. In my hotel rooms in the morning and night in all these cities, I see these vicious ads full of lies, full of fear. It's the trajectory of fear to hate to violence. That's our trajectory now, and we got to break into that. So I think I often, since is a show you can talk about religion with you. The Bible has two kinds of time. One is chronos time. That's the word used, meaning incremental, tick-tock, normal time. The other is kairos time. And kairos time comes up in the scriptures as a time which can change time for decades or even generations. I'm convinced we're in this Kairos moment. This is far deeper than candidates and politics and Republican, Democrat. I often say, don't go left, don't go right, go deeper. So I'm
Mm,
trying to do that on the road. It's really becoming a genuine faith struggle for a lot of people on the road about what to do in a time like this when we're so divided, yelling back and forth. And we got poll chaplains we're training. We're training these, we call them poll
I
chaplains.
was going to ask you about that. How's that? I read a piece in your Substack
Yeah.
about that happening in 2022, but I haven't. I'd love to hear some updates about this cycle, 2024, how the poll chaplain's going.
Well, the good news is it's today's Substack just went up
Oh, good. Okay.
this morning, but it's called Poll Chaplains and Peacekeepers. In fact, I was on a call yesterday with all our poll chaplains from 10 battleground states, uh, mostly clergy. And the clergy and people who aren't ordained but are lay people in their congregations. And literally, I tell stories today how you've had situations where you had white men showing up with guns at black polling places and unarmed clergy uh, coming to surround them and saying, no, this is, let's move on from here. Or trucks, pickup trucks full of flags and guns and all that,
Yeah.
parking next to outside a black elementary school that's a polling place. And so the image of unarmed clergy taking on armed men is a very
Wow.
powerful thing.
Yeah.
And so we've trained 1,000 for this election in perilous polling places. They're focused on low income minority communities, and they want to suppress votes. They want to intimidate votes. They want to subvert the process. And I can't recall before. I've talked to the Maricopa County election commissioner, third biggest county in America, I think, out in Arizona. I said, what do you lose sleep at night over? He said, it's the safety of my staff.
Mm,
When does the safety of poll workers become an issue? They're doing bulletproof glass and they're training these places. I talk about that in my column today on Substack. So this is a moment when faith is really, it's a test of democracy. Many people understand that. But it's also a test of faith. And that's what we're trying to raise up around the country.
so have you heard about any of your poll chaplains coming in contact? I've read more and more about guys like Steve Bannon who are trying to galvanize
Right.
literally armies
Yeah.
around the country, troops, if you
Yeah.
will, around the country to do exactly what you're talking about, to, if nothing else, to engage in this a set of tactics that are meant to simply intimidate. So, for example, just even somebody like me, when I hear about a bomb going off, a homemade bomb going off in a drop box,
Right.
one has to wonder, well, do I want to subject myself to that day? There has to, but I'm curious, have any of your poll chaplains come in direct contact with some of these troops, for lack of a better word, that Steve Bannon has been deploying? How have those interactions gone?
Well, in my column today, I talk about this new Apostolic Reformation movement. It's this very right-wing, charismatic Christian thing. And they say, you are warriors appointed by God, warriors appointed by God. And one of their evangelists said, uh, well, I'm not here to be blessed. I'm here to be armed and dangerous.
Mm,
And in contrast to that, I want to raise what Jesus said in the Beatitudes, Matthew 5, blessed are the peacemakers, for they should be called the children of God. That's a pretty wonderful distinction. And yes, we've had situations where in this column I write about a bishop, a friend of mine who's leading our efforts in North Carolina. And he came in and there was this armed man, a white man carrying his weapon, standing outside black voters, waiting in line to vote, or these trucks. And he said he just surrounded them with clergy and said, uh, you're probably looking for the bathroom. We'll help you find it and let them away. Or in Detroit, Steve Bland, Reverend Steve Bland, uh, you know, like Claude Alexander in North Carolina, he was on the phone with me and he said, "Oh, I gotta go. There's a truck outside one
Right.
of school." So I'll call you back. Call me back and says, "Yeah, they again clergy surrounded this very intimidating truck with Confederate flags and men with guns, and they said, we think you're in an illegal parking place. No, we're going to help you not get a ticket." Now, if some left-wing activists would have confronted these people, there might have been some confrontation. So we're training now in our pole chaplain training, where we go a whole half hour just on de-escalation tactics, how to deal with verbal abuse or attacks or even physical threats, and how to make contact, how to eye contact, how to have a conversation, how to be a calming uh, presence with moral authority. Our whole thing is bipartisan. We're not going to do how to vote. We're protecting the idea of a free, fair, and safe election. So, yeah, we're now training more and more in how to confront potential intimidation because,
Mm.
uh, this new Reformation group, they're actually saying we're going to be like Trojan horses. That's their language at polling places. Trojan horses, and where they're going to suggest that people be pulled out of line and their registration tested and vetted. Of course, who they're pulling out of line are people of color or Hispanic people who might be illegal. Well,
Hmm.
that almost never happens, but they're pulling them out of line, which is intimidating.
Right.
So we're training poll chaplains in being peacemakers, and we're ready for whatever happens around the country. But I can't predict now what, because they are doing what you're saying. They're calling for aggressive poll monitoring, which becomes intimidation.
Yeah. I want to back up for a second because there's so many topics that you cover in the book, um, the intersection of faith and politics.
Yeah.
And by the way, before we move on, I should say that pretty early on after I became a Christian, I found myself at odds with what I was encountering in God's word in scripture versus what I was seeing play out. I think I told you that I became a Christian in the early 2000s. So shortly thereafter, there were certain passages that were hitting me that didn't reckon with some of the most prominent, most important issues that a lot of my friends from church were engaging with. In particular, at that time, it was the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. And I was having a hard time. And I think it might have been a couple of years later, someone pointed me in your direction, Sojourners' direction. I think God's Politics came out at that time. So
Right.
I do have to say that your work and your words, your ministry, if you will, did help me begin to make sense of it. Um, some of the folks that you've quoted, even in this most recent book, N.T. Wright's work probably had, um,
Right.
especially in those big books, the volume on the resurrection, really just helped me kind of work through a lot of the theological quandaries that
Yeah.
I was wrestling with.
Wonderful
Um,
New Testament scholar, into right.
Oh
Tom.
man, I love his treatments of all the books of the New Testament.
Hmm.
That really helps me to think through some of these things. But again, I've always found myself a little bit at odds. I haven't gone about my questioning in the most look. I'm a Jew from Jersey, so at the end of the day, I still got some sharp elbows. So I could probably learn from that piece a little bit more of the peacemaking that you're talking about. One of the issues I wanted to ask you about was the word evangelical.
Sure.
It seems to me that the word evangelical has taken on a very different meaning. But I get the sense you're not ready to cede that ground to the folks who've basically hijacked it. Am I reading that right?
You are. The God's Politics book you mentioned is probably the best subtitle I've ever done for a book. Why the right gets it wrong and the left doesn't get it. But I do in this book talk about my evangelical upbringing in Detroit, and and there were these big questions. I'm now a white teenager listening to my city, uh, and I'm reading the papers, hearing the news, and big questions about life seems so different in Black Detroit than in white Detroit. And I asked these questions, and my white world just didn't want to answer the questions. And I went into, so I tell my students at Georgetown, trust your questions and follow them to wherever they take you. So my questions took me into Detroit, and I just showed up at Black churches.
Mm,
And I met Black evangelicals who are so different than white
yeah.
evangelicals. And one of those men, Bill Pinnell, I met at a Black church, same denomination as mine. He became an elder for me for the rest of my life. He just passed away just 2 weeks ago at 95. And there's a wonderful thing called The Gospel According to Bill Pinnell and Fuller Seminary, where he was on the faculty, on the board there, lays it out. It was a whole different gospel than I'd heard in my white church world. And so for me, I don't want to cede it, you're right, to people who are so politicized on the right. Jesus, in his first, I call it his first gig, his first press conference at Nazareth, where he was speaking, he announcing his mission. He said, quoting Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." And the word there for good news in the original language is evangel, from which we get evangelical and evangelism. So evangel means good news to the poor. So any gospel of Jesus that isn't good news to poor people, whatever else it is, isn't the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I bring these texts up all through my book because I want to go back to the text. I don't want to just have a political argument or persuade people to watch Rachel Maddow or something.
Right,
Uh,
right.
you got to go. There's bad theology going on here, and I'm trying to speak to that. Well, the false white gospel, white Christian nationalism, is bad theology. It isn't just bad politics; it's bad theology. So how do we go back to the text, what Jesus said and did? So that's what I'm trying to do all over the country now: is bring Jesus in those texts into the conversation. So to me, to be an evangelical is to follow what Jesus said at his first gig
Yeah.
about what the evangel means. So I won't give that away to people who have politicized the gospel on the right.
So I have a tough question for maybe it's not a tough question, but I've had experiences where friends of mine who are primarily Republicans, primarily, Fox News. I'm not even going to call them conservatives, but like a Fox News or
Yeah,
OANN type of a conservative. Talk about another word that's been hijacked. It's not what Burke meant by, when we think about conservative philosophy, let alone William F. Buckley or Jack Kemp. But
right.
I've had encounters, one in particular that was really pronounced, where a pastor of one of the larger churches at the time in this valley was doing a 5-week series leading up to the 2012 election. And one of them was on the issue of immigration. And he took a verse at the top of Leviticus 19 to make the argument that it should be a closed border and anti-immigrant talk. And being a Jew, just having studied my Torah diligently, I happen to know that chapter. And I'm like, Dave, you you got to read the rest of the chapter, man, because I think if you
Right,
get to the bottom there, it makes exactly the opposite argument that you're trying to make here
right,
about closed borders and what have
right.
you. So my tough question, if you call it that, is there's a proclivity to start with our political preferences and then back scripture into it. How do we know that we're not doing the same thing? It's just maybe a different hat that we're wearing. Does that make
Yeah,
sense? What I'm asking?
sure, sure. Um, I do a podcast as well. I should have you on my podcast too. And it starts by saying our faith should shape our politics and not the other way around. As simple as that is, it's so very important. Like your friend, I taught the immigration issue in my class just last week, and the word "ger" in Hebrew scriptures for immigrant is 100 times all over
Mm,
the place. And in those Hebrew scriptures, It says, remember you were once strangers.
Right.
And then when Springfield happened in Ohio, and J.D. Vance and Donald Trump started saying that the Haitian immigrants, they said, were illegal. They were legal, but they're
Yeah.
stealing and eating dogs and cats. Of course, that wasn't true. J.D. Vance later admitted it wasn't true, but they kept saying it, right? To me, that was a Matthew 25 moment. My conversion text was in Matthew 25. I got converted out of the student movements I was in. And it says, Jesus says, I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was naked. I was a stranger. I was sick in prison. I was a stranger. The word there means immigrant, literally means that. So immigration is very complicated policy-wise. It's a broken system. Both sides, in my view, are responsible for that, and both sides are going to have to fix it. But you don't demean and demonize immigrants and threaten to deport millions of them. And that's not consistent with what Jesus says in Matthew 25. So I want to have, to your point, a dialogue, even a debate about faith, where people want to raise those questions. I say, don't go left, don't go right, go deeper. I don't believe in politicizing faith or being a chaplain for the right or the left. So I want to look at what those texts say, those Leviticus texts about immigration, that Matthew text. What do the texts say, and what should that mean for how we shape our visions and our policies? So it's a fair question to say, are you getting that right, or is there a different way to look at it? I'm all for that.
Yeah, let's keep reading. Let's
keep
look at
reading
it.
and keep talking, right?
Yeah. So I do want to draw out this point a little bit more because I'm looking at Matthew 25 in a very different way. One of my favorite, I'm getting chills just remembering it. One of my favorite stories in the book is about a lady named Mary Glover and Mary Glover's prayer. Could you tell us about that?
Well, because I read this text after we had the big student strike in 1970, that's how old I am. I was at Michigan State, and I wasn't happy with. I knew I wanted to live my life as an activist, but I knew the foundation for that, and I wasn't satisfied with Marx, Ho Chi Minh, and Che Guevara, like we were all reading at the time. And I got to this text in Matthew 25. And the idea of the Son of God saying, as you've done to the most vulnerable and the poor, you've done literally to me. So I studied all the commentaries on that after it brought me back to my Christian faith. But then I moved to Washington, our little group from Chicago, and started Sojourners here, our community. And Mary Glover was this wonderful woman in our neighborhood who, like many like her, were the glue that held things together. She was not formally educated, taught cooked in a daycare center for not much, but she was a Pentecostal woman who prayed like she knew to whom she was talking. And she always said the prayer. The neighborhood wanted to start a little food line on Saturday mornings, just groceries, a bag of groceries for the 200 people in line who needed it, 20 blocks from the White House. And she would always say our prayer because she was our best prayer. I would even come home from a trip just to hear Mary Glover pray. She was an elder to me a long time ago, for a long time. And she said, Lord, thanks for waking me up. Walls of my room were not the walls of my grave, and my bed was not my cooling board. Thank you, Lord. Then I said this, Lord, we know you'll be coming through this line today. So, Lord, help us to treat you well. Help us to treat you well. That was the best commentary on Matthew 25 I'd ever heard.
Yeah.
And whenever I'm walking around the neighborhood and bumping her, and she said, you don't look like you're very hopeful today. Come by the apartment. We need to talk again. And she had this powerful hope, and she was a missionary in that neighborhood that just took care of lots of people. But she could see Jesus coming through that line today. And we often miss seeing where Jesus comes as an immigrant right now. What does that mean as those who are lacking health care, those who are sick, those who are imprisoned. If one in three black men in America have a relationship with the criminal justice system. The policing that I talked about with my players. So she helped me to see. She could see and see where was Jesus coming through the lines, and how well we were going to be treating him where we saw.
Yeah. I love and am and encouraged by how hopeful you are for the church here in our country. I happen to live in Santa Clarita Valley, which, if you don't know, it's where where I guess it's called Masters University now is, where John MacArthur is the head of that university, and Grace Community is just across just over the hill. So I'm surrounded, and kind of was born into the faith, surrounded by folks that are
Yeah,
MacArthurites, if you will.
right. Right.
How pervasive do you think dominionist theology is among people who identify as Christians in America and American churches today? And how pervasive is nationalism, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very pervasive and persuasive to a lot of folks, even people who are good folks. And you mentioned the word dominionist theology. That's important for your listeners to understand. That's not new. This white Christian nationalism, it goes way back, even before the founding of this country. And from papal bulls to Puritan teaching, they said that the white Europeans coming to this land, the land belonged to them. They would have dominion over that land. And the problem is, this wonderfully inclusive, welcoming, inviting gospel is not meant to be white, or it's not meant to be assumed that whiteness is the standard. And Christian, but they don't mean sacrifice or service. They mean control. They use the word dominion.
Mm.
We're to have dominion over the land. And third, it says nationalist. Well, when Jesus spoke to his followers the last time, he said, "Go into all the world, make disciples of every nation, teaching them to observe whatever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world." Well, this is a global movement that brings people together, and that's to me is gospel. And when Christian dominionism lifts up the nation, worships the nation, the Bible would call that idolatry. Idolatry. It's an idol, worshiping a false god, putting America first, as they say. I love this country. I am old enough to have been all over this country, but patriotism is very different than that kind of nationalism, the winning and losing. Our nation is better and will win by any means necessary. That's not Christian. So I want to bring this all back to what we say our faith calls us to. And in this Faith United to Save Democracy, we have rabbis joining us. We have imams joining us. It's multi-faith, and it's multiracial for sure. It's also multi-generational. You know, we're reaching out to a lot of young people who often aren't reached by even some of their clergy in the streets. And so we have a wonderful event coming. Looks like tomorrow night's going to happen, where Steph Curry is joining a
Oh,
number of
wow.
pastors. I reached out to Steph about mobilizing Black men in this country. Steph is an influencer
Yeah.
with young people in the streets, and he's a Christian. And for him, voting, what John Lewis called the preciousness of our vote, or Raphael Warnock says, voting is like a prayer for our children and what kind of nation we want to be. So I think what I'm hopeful about is I see in this crisis, in response to this false white gospel, that a number of people generationally, I mean, colleges and students are pouring into these things. If this brings us back to what it means to be a follower of Jesus, that to me could be a hopeful sign. But I don't know how this election will be altered or controlled or distorted by this Christian dominionist theology, which to me is bad theology, but is pervasive now in many of our white churches. That's where it's pervasive. It's not in black churches.
What is it that you say the way to confront bad theology is with a truer faith? How do you put it again? A truer
Well,
faith?
uh, the best way to confront bad religion, in my view, is not with no religion, but better religion, better faith, true faith,
True faith.
restoring true faith. Now, to be honest, Corey, there are days when some of the stuff on the far Christian right gets so bad. I, I wonder about what kind of impact religion's having, to be honest. But the best way to confront that is not just with politics, but with true faith. And let's have a conversation about
Yeah.
what faith really is.
I do think that there are, I, I don't know how to describe it, but the phrase that's coming to mind is spiritual antibodies. I think there are a number of spiritual antibodies. For example, one of the central questions in your book is is who is my neighbor? Your your,
Yeah,
your treatment of a most famous one of the more famous parables. Why don't I just ask you, when you say neighbor, what do you mean by that?
I love that you raised the Good Samaritan parable because to me it's so central. Asking asking the most important question: who is my neighbor? Now, it was a lawyer in the story who came to Jesus.
Who is it? Right? He's the one who asks, right?
Yeah. And now I've studied that passage deeply, and I realized it's a Washington lawyer. I know that tone of voice, you know.
Yeah.
So, okay, what must I do, he says, to inherit eternal life? He
Yeah.
says, Jesus says, I think you know it's written in the law. You know what it says, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. He says, okay, but he says, who is my neighbor? And it's not, who is my neighbor? How can I welcome them? It's exactly who am I obligated to? So he's asking Jesus, perhaps the most important question in this election: who is my neighbor? Most important question for democracy. And for a democracy that is closer to becoming a multiracial democracy than we've ever been, this is all a reaction to all of that, a fear of all that. And Jesus says, well, let me give you an example.
Yeah.
And he picks a Samaritan. Now, in Judean society that he was speaking to, there were no good Samaritans. They were mixed race. They
Yeah.
were half-breeds. They were false worshipers,
Impure. They were the other
impure,
guys, the other, yeah.
and dangerous.
Yeah.
And I said on the road some nights, I've said, in fact, there were Samaritans with cartels from Mexico entering the United States with guns and disease. Oh no, I got that group wrong. But we were othered. They're
Right.
othered like we're othering people now. You know,
Right.
cartels of immigrants are coming to eat your dogs and cats. So that's what Samaritans were treated like, the other they were. And yet, here's this man, and Jewish scholars have told me the man by the side of the road who'd been beaten and robbed and left for half dead was Jewish. So here's a Samaritan who's othered by the culture around him, and he stops to help someone who's other than him, other to him, on the road. And he's risking. Jericho Road's a dangerous place. He takes his time, changes his schedule, offers his resources. That's the example. So that book chapter title is called "Your Neighbor Probably Lives Outside Your Neighborhood." And
Yeah.
so, how are the people different than us? How are we loving them as our neighbor? That's so crucial to how to become a multiracial democracy. Good Samaritan can help lead us to being a place where our different racial, ethnic, cultural identities are to become one, where we are fighting for the common ground, e pluribus unum, where we become one. So Good Samaritan speaks directly to all of that.
Yeah.
And I want to take Jesus' teaching seriously there.
One of the most frequent words that I hear used is they or them.
I know.
And I've gotten into the habit of asking if it's somebody that I have a relationship with,
Yeah.
who do you mean by them?
Yeah.
They're going to steal this election. Make no mistake. Who do you mean by them? Dems and the fake news. Well, hold on, hold on. Do you mean everybody who's registered as a Democrat? And anybody who's voted for a Democrat? Anybody like how are we defining the word them? And it also in thinking about who is my neighbor, I was reading it. I got to that treatment the same day that Trump was having the rally at Madison Square Garden. I couldn't help but wonder. I know people who went to that rally,
Yeah.
people I graduated high school with. I can't help but wonder if you just kind of looked around, to your neighbor to your right and your neighbor to your left in that audience, how might my friends answer that question? Who is my neighbor? I have to wonder about that. I also have to wonder how do I more effectively engage in that conversation with my friends who went to that rally?
So I've been in conversation all week with Puerto Rican Christian leaders who at that rally had, it was said, there's an island of garbage floating in the ocean. It's called Puerto Rico.
Right.
And they were just devastated by that. And Puerto Rican Christians span the political spectrum. And yet that was so devastating. And we are in now, as you rightly say, a politics of us and them. And Martin Buber, the great Jewish theologian, talked about I and thou,
Yeah.
I and thou, as opposed to us and them. We can't get into the us and them politics. And time again in the Trump ads, they literally say, these are them and we are us. I'm against them and for us. And he's speaking to his white base. And so this is so divisive. And a lot of Republicans I know who don't agree with a lot of Kamala Harris's policies are voting for her because as you've got his former generals, chief of staff John Kelly and General Milley, was the Joint Chiefs of Staff head. They're the ones who are using the word, having worked with him, as fascist, the way he talks and acts. They're the ones. These are conservative Republicans
Yeah.
and military men that he appointed to take jobs close to him. And watching his behavior, they're now saying that he wants to govern like a dictator. And he has, we've all heard this, his enemies list. And he even names Democratic elected officials who are just people who disagree with him, and they're on an enemies list. And so this is not a normal election. This is not just Republicans and Democrats who together respect the rule of law, together respect the Constitution, together will accept the peaceful transfer of power. And he's saying he won't. He won't. So this is a moral moment, not just a political debate.
Well, let me bring this to the personal.
Yeah.
You say at one point, or you pose the question, what if our peacemaking were to be extended to the churches? I think you introduced that with our dinner tables. We have Thanksgiving coming up in a few weeks. I also think about it as our local coffee shop or around our little league fields or soccer fields. How, what are some of the ways that we can be more winsome and to stay in that conversation, to elevate the importance of the relationship over how passionately we feel about a particular position or politician that we're supporting?
Yeah.
How can we get better at that?
That's that's the those are the final questions always coming up at each of these events I'm going to. Hundreds of people. We talk through these passages. We talk through where we are as a nation and this moment in time. And that's the question. How do I talk to my fellow congregants who are so different than I am politically, or so angry, or so fearful, or so hateful, or my own family? At my dinner table, my students at Georgetown, definitely want to have a lecture or conversation before Thanksgiving about how to talk at their tables. Uncle Fred or even Dad,
Yeah.
Uh, and so I say you've got to find common ground. And it can't be just political arguments or MSNBC versus Fox. It's got to be out of your relationship to people. And if they're Christian and you are too, then you can go to these texts. You can go to the Good Samaritan parable. You can go to Matthew 25 and what it says about treating the stranger, John, what he says about the truth, making us free. Um, the Galatians text, which says, no longer Jew or Gentile, bond or free, male or female, all are one in Christ. Well, that text, that's race, class, and gender that are always involved in division. And I learned that text was a baptismal text in the early church. They read it at every baptism. And they're saying, in effect, we are people who don't always do things perfectly, but part of our mission, our vocation, is to bring people together across these lines of race and class and gender. And I learned, Corey, that text in the Fisk University Library, they have all these white slaveholder Bibles, from those times. That text, Galatians 3:28, was removed
Oh,
from all
wow.
the slaveholder Bibles because it's such a threat.
Right.
It's white Christian nationalism. So I'm going back in that question to Micah often, who says, what does the Lord require of you? He says, do justice. I'm glad that comes first. When a university gives you a chair and center with your two favorite words, faith and justice, you're a
Yeah.
happy.
Yeah.
That's my word, justice. But then it says, love kindness, love kindness. And then it says, and walk humbly with your God. So I say to people on these events, all the social justice advocates I know aren't always kind to the people we're talking to. Or even deeper, we aren't always humble. I often say, I'm as old as I've ever been. And they all laugh. I say, but I don't know all the answers. I don't have all the answers. And so how do you have a conversation? I tell my students, say, Dad, you're wrong, but thanks for paying for my college.
Yeah. Yeah.
They say, no, I want you to know how I'm thinking, how I'm changing. And most parents want to know what their kids are thinking and how they're changing and how they're wrestling with things. So it's got to be relational. It's got to focus on the God of the Bible is a God of justice, not just a God of charity. That's clear in the prophets and certainly in Jesus. So let's talk about these texts that we have in common. But I want to be kind and I want to be humble and talk to people who I love and who love me and go deeper than politics. Now that's hard these days, but uh, as I said to you before, I get put on planes flying around. I'm always sitting next to Republicans on these
Right.
planes,
Right. That's
and you're
God's
there,
hand. God's hand
you're
is at
there,
work.
right, for
Yeah.
an hour, and they all want to talk.
Yeah.
And I got a note from one of them today saying, thanks for the talk we had. It's almost impossible these days to people who are on different political sides to have an honest, uh, fair, truthful conversation. So I'm really glad we had that hour. Or another woman, Republican, came off the plane. She said, can I give you a hug? This was the best conversation on faith and politics I've ever had. So my strategy now, Corey, is to get on as many planes as I can before next Tuesday and sit next to Republicans.
That's great. Oh man, I don't have to look too far in my valley to sit next to Republicans, so
That's
I could
right.
just go to the coffee shop or uh,
And
I
we need to do that. Coffee shops and barber shops and Thanksgiving dinner tables. We need to have those conversations that we're often afraid to have
yeah.
because
You
this
know what?
is so important.
One of the things that got me thinking is I started at this church, Grace Baptist Church, which was originally an offshoot of a lot of masters, seminarians,
Yeah.
John MacArthur acolytes, if you will. I didn't understand those distinctions at the time, but it got me thinking maybe I should start going back to grace, putting myself in some of those Bible studies. In Yiddish, there's I think the proper word is Tsurasmacha, but my grandfather, being a Brooklyn kid, messed it up. He called it Tsiskamacha, troublemaker, you know. Um, but I don't know if that would exemplify the verse from Micah that you just quoted, the the kindness and the humble. I'd probably get myself into more trouble than I needed to if I put
Yeah.
myself back in those Bible studies.
Well, Sam Perry, who wrote one of the best books on all of this called The Cross in the Flag, he teaches it in Norman, Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma. And I was with him the other day at an event, and he has, in fact, his family gone back to a conservative church
Mm,
and been a member there to have these conversations, to go outside your comfort zones. And we all live in bubbles. How do we get beyond that? We have almost different parallel universes of facts in this country. And I see with all these ads that are just lying over and over, but it's working. They wouldn't be doing it over and over. And so Sam has said one of his things for himself and his family is to go and talk to people and become friends with people and have a relation with people who are not just in your bubble, you
yeah,
know. And I think that's so important now, not just for the election, but afterwards, because all of the anger and fear and hate and even violence isn't going to go away with an election.
yeah, yeah,
Uh, every nation has uh, their better angels and their worst demons, better angels and worst demons. And we have our demons of race run so deep in this nation. And so we're seeing not just a mobilizing of grievance, but a mobilizing of our demons, our worst selves. So that's why this is more than an election. I would say that this biblical language for time, chronos, normal time versus kairos time, time that changes time, that's what's at stake now. So these conversations between now and the election and after the election are really important for us to have. So it isn't just competing networks and competing websites and competing podcasts,
yeah.
but people who are in relationship, having serious, personal, faith-based conversations.
So I want to pick up on that point because you seem hopeful, and you even get into optimism versus hope, which I appreciate. But there's a quote at the end that I want to share. You say, "A new civic discipleship will express itself in loving our neighbors, finding the truth that can set us free, and acknowledging the image of God in every member of humanity, accepting practices of conflict resolution, reversing the structures of our dramatic inequities, and including all of our tribes in a genuine multiracial democracy." So you do seem hopeful that this is already happening. How do you see this all coming about or continuing in the work?
Well, that's my altar call. That's what you just read is what I believe so deeply. I'm hopeful that's is already happening, and yet I don't know how it will play out in this election, in our politics, and whether it would be a framework for going forward, or whether we'll just be set back into all this divisiveness. And I do think there is the undergirding thing here is that we're by 2040 or 50, we're no longer a white majority nation. We're going to be a majority of minorities. And I think there's a lot of white folks who just aren't ready for that, or afraid of that, or they've been told they're going to lose with that, or they're going to be destroyed, or their way of life, or their faith being destroyed by it. That's not true, but it plays on fear. And it's interesting. I was on the road, and Marshall Gans, who's a veteran organizer, I met him at Harvard when I was there teaching. And he said, fear shuts off parts of our brain. I said, so I quoted him at an event. And afterwards, a doctor came up and said, That's right. I'm a doctor. And we see when we do MRIs, brain waves change. People are afraid of MRIs because you're in that chamber. The results could be terrible for your life or death. And people are afraid. And we see their brain waves move from the cerebral cortex, which is the rational part of our brain, to other parts, which are just protect, 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 fear and flight. So literally, fear triggers a lack of rationality, a lack of thinking things through. And when I heard that from the doctor, and then he sent me a bunch of stuff on neurology, and I thought, well, even brain waves are shaping this election, and so that's why so many ads are based on fear,
Yeah.
based on fear. So there's deep stuff going on here, and as a nation, we're trying to decide what kind of nation we want to be, and who belongs, and who doesn't belong, who our neighbors are. And rather than turning neighbors into enemies, we have to be neighbors who can disagree on matters of policy and politics. That's what democracy is. I want to see that disagreement on policy. I'm in Washington. We need that conversation. But the fear is running very deep. So my hope is deeper, as you suggested, than optimism. And my chair at Georgetown is named after a mentor of mine, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who did teach me the difference between optimism and hope. And optimism, he said, is often a feeling or a mood or a personality type. My wife is a cup half full person, and I'm a cup half empty person. But he said, no, hope is deeper than that. It's not a mood or a feeling. It's a choice, a decision you make because of this thing that we call faith. Hebrews 11:1 says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I love that text. And my best paraphrase is hope means believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. So I don't know what the election, an election could just devastate this country, and all kinds of fear and hate and violence could set in, enemies lists and attacking people who are not felt to belong because they're people of color. But it's also underneath that, there's a lot going on, and we'll see how it plays out politically. But I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to stand down or stop speaking out. And I love it when a Black church leader who is also a mentor for me in his 90s, at a gathering I was with him, and he was standing up, and he's in his 90s. He's very tall, and he was preaching. He says, in the Black churches, whether we have democracy or not, we keep standing up. Whether this election takes democracy away from us or not, we'll keep standing up. We Black church leaders keep standing up. And he stood up tall. And I needed to hear that, So how do we stand up? No matter what the polling turns out to be in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona.
Yeah. It's like that story that you share at the end of Desmond Tutu. I think it was in the early to mid 80s when he was at a gathering, and these soldiers of apartheid were in the church taking notes with the threatening demeanor and, armed. And his reaction to that, you could describe the story better than I think. Weren't you there? You were there, weren't
I
you?
was there. It was my first day ever in South Africa. I've been many days and weeks and months since, but first time. And it was surrounded, the St. George Cathedral was surrounded by troops on the outside, automatic weapons and helmets, hundreds of them. And then they broke into his sanctuary, the South African security police, who really are thugs. And they're lining the walls, as you
Yeah.
say. They're with tape recorders and notepads, and they're kind of saying, go ahead, be prophetic, be bold. You just came out of prison, and we'll put you right back there.
Right.
And they're kind of saying, it's my first day. He invited me to come, but I'm sitting there. And it's almost like they're saying, we own this country. Apartheid. We own you. We own this church. We own your God. And he stopped talking and he bowed in prayer. And we wonder what in the world's he going to do or say. And all of a sudden he looks up, little man, long flowing robes, like looking like Yoda. And he smiles, that signature Desmond Tutu smile.
Yeah.
And he lifts his arm and he says, you are powerful, very powerful, but you're not gods. And smiles. I serve a God who cannot be mocked. So we invite you today. No, we're surrounded. We
Yeah.
invite you today to come and join the winning side. And the young kids leapt out of their seats and danced outside to the troops, and we followed them. And these military didn't know what to do with dancing worshipers who weren't afraid. And he taught me, he gave me a different trajectory than fear, hate, and violence. The trajectory was faith that prompts hope, that creates action, that causes change. Faith, hope, action, change. So that's my trajectory now that I'll put up against the political trajectory of fear and hate and violence anytime.
Faith, hope, action, change, which doesn't change regardless of who wins the election.
Yeah, we have real work to do in this country, despite who wins the elections. These things aren't going away.
Yeah.
These things aren't going away. So
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a real test of faith. And the third test for me is all the young people that I talk to around the country or in my classes, and they're watching faith leaders see what they say and don't say, what they do and don't do, whether they stand up and speak up, or whether they're calling for, what Dr. King called the beloved community, where we
Yeah.
all come together, or for a very, racialized, divisive society. They're
Well,
watching.
before we start to wind it down, I want to give you the opportunity to turn the tables on me and ask if do you have any questions for me?
Well, I'm particularly curious about you said you have lots of neighbors around you who may be on a different side of politics than you are, or even in your podcasts and guests and listeners. What do you mostly hear from them? And what have you learned is your best way to respond to them?
So I'll start with the second question first. My best way to respond is let's go grab a beer.
Yeah.
Let's go get a coffee. Let's get together. Let's hang out. Um, so what I'm hearing from them, uh, I, I, I hesitate to say them because everybody's a little bit different,
Yeah.
but so I have specific individuals in mind. But a lot of times, if I turn on Sean Hannity's radio show for the first 15 minutes of his show, or his monologue on his news program, or even just the Fox News morning show,
Mm-hmm.
I can turn it on for all of about 5 minutes, and I know what a lot of my friends are going to be talking about.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Whether they're listening to Fox News or they have a few podcasts, a Dan Bongino show or Mark Levin's show, I know what they're going to be talking. So today or yesterday, I had a feeling that the garbage thing would become a theme, and
Yeah.
indeed, three or four of
It
my
did.
friends were posting about I'm garbage, I'm proud to be garbage. They kind of, because it's something that President Biden slipped up with. So any given day, it's there. You know what? There's a verse that you shared, and this really captures it. The verse is from 2 Timothy 4. It's for the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. So what a lot of my friends are saying, they're captured by what their itching ears want to hear. And there's not really a deeply rooted philosophy that grounds them. Their feet are firmly planted in midair, as one of my friends would say, um, and it's dictated by what they're hearing. The information ecosystem that they're feeding their minds on a daily basis. So a lot of times how I interact, again, it's, hey, are you giving me the privilege of staying in this relationship with you? Just the other day, I had a great reunion with someone
Huh.
that I last year after October 7th, I was not in a good state. I have family in Israel, feel very
Mhm.
passionately connected
Yeah.
to what's happening there. And this fella, he's a Trump supporter. And some of our conversations in the immediate aftermath was, hey, how do you feel now that, your people, and he was associating me with
Yeah.
some of the terrorists, frankly,
Right.
because he associates me more with, even though I'm actually a Burkean or Buckleyan or Kempian conservative, he associates
Yeah.
me because I'm not a Trumpian
Right.
with being a liberal. So I ended up not showing my best self, and I had to shut him out for a time until I was in a
Mhm.
better headspace and heart
Sure.
space.
Yeah.
But we had this 3.5 hour talk the other day over a beer at a local, and we still disagree passionately. We found that some of the things were even further apart on specific issues, but we were in the conversation together.
Yeah.
And one of the commitments that we made at the top of the conversation was we're going to talk about issues, we're going to talk about ideas, but we're going to do our best to do it in such a way that we're not attacking each other.
That's right.
You know.
Right.
So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are
No,
some
it
of the
does. In
thoughts.
fact, but that text, I love that text. Uh, uh, Paul's writing to his apprentice Timothy, and itching ears, itching ears. It was written in AD 65, a long time ago, and it's
Yeah,
like as current as it could possibly be. There are algorithms now that strategically aim at people's itching ears,
mm,
what they want to hear. They keep hearing the same things over and over again. So how do we go beyond uh, arguing over talking points on both sides, talking points, and get to uh, relationship and get to, I would say, get to the text. What does the text really say here, and what does it mean? And have conversations. Neighbors in conversation together is the future of our democracy, but also I think the soul of this nation, our spirituality as well. So hang in there with those conversations before and
absolutely.
after the election because they're going to be needed.
Yeah, yeah, and I have some of the bruises and scars to show for staying in those conversations sometimes. So before we go, let us know how it can find the False White Gospel, a great most recent book, your Substack, your podcast. How can you find you and all the great work that you're doing?
Well, the false white gospel is, it's on Amazon, it's in bookstores, so that's easy to find. Um, the podcast I do is called The Soul of the Nation. So I talk about these things in a hopefully soulful way, not just a political way every time. And I do say our faith should shape our politics, not the other way around, beginning of every podcast. And my Substack is called God's Politics, like the old book, God's
Yeah,
Politics. Easy to find in Substack. Uh, I also do a lot of stuff for religious news service, which is doing a great job on putting all the faith issues out there. So we're trying to have a deeper conversation, and America needs a deeper conversation than our polarized talking points have led us to. So with Soul of the Nation podcast and just the Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown, we're easy to find Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown. So we have a newsletter and we have events and we have events often where politicians are asked to talk about their higher calling. But what about their faith takes them to a higher place than just politics? And so those who will continue. And we have a lot to talk about. And I have enjoyed this conversation a great
as
deal.
as have I. We'll be sure to put those links in the show notes.
Great.
Well, Reverend Wallis, Coach Jim, this is a real
Coach Jim.
pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
I did too. I did too.
And it's a real honor for me because, like I said, I've been studying your work for a couple of decades now. So it's such a treat. It's such a thrill to be able to, to talk to the guy. So,
Well, we become friends today, which I'm
oh
looking
man,
forward
that's
to
great.
continuing.
And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow this show, write that review, and now you can watch these conversations on YouTube and support us on Patreon. It's youtube.com/@politicsandreligion and patreon.com/politicsandreligion. Check them all out. Subscribe, get some TP&R swag. Your support really does make a difference. So thank you for all of it. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.